Kia ora everyone, welcome back to our next edition of Econ Talks. Gareth, we know that housing remains a key focus for everyone in the economy throughout New Zealand, more important and certainly more enduring than just about any other topic we ever discuss. But the latest numbers aren't particularly good for particularly first home buyers, people in the housing market. Things are turning around. Yes, in the short term, we've seen 6 months of house price declines at the moment. Interest rates, though, going higher. Overall, what's the long-term picture when it comes to housing affordability? Is now a good time or not?
It's not so much a question of affordability, Brad, but it's about looking at, the sort of financial benefits that you might get from the house over time. And the reality is, look, with house prices so expensive, you've got two major things working against you as a first home buyer. Firstly, the reality is we're seeing at the moment with house prices, of course, that they seem to be coming back off their peak. And so that means in the near term, over the next couple of years possibly, that you're facing a situation where if you buy now, houses could be worth 10% less in a couple of years' time. And so you've immediately made a big capital loss on that. Yes, you'll claw that back probably over subsequent years, but it's not a great starting position as a homeowner. And we know that looking back over the last 10 years, we've had such a big housing boom that must be some reasonably significant downside risks around house prices, which are just starting to work their way through the system now. The other aspect, of course, about how high house prices are is that relative to your income, they're really expensive, and that means that you're going to have to be devoting a huge amount of your income to servicing that mortgage, not just in the first year, we've seen that in the past, but also right throughout the rest of your next 25 years or 30 years that you have that mortgage for, because housing is so expensive. Generally speaking, the only way we see really strong income growth is when inflation is high. And yes, inflation is running at 7% at the moment, but it's not like the 15 or 20% inflation that we saw during the 1980s, which helped to reduce that debt servicing cost pretty quickly relative to your income. Here you're facing, still by the time you're finishing paying off your mortgage, paying over 20% of your income to service that mortgage, whereas for a buyer 15 or 20 years ago, it was a figure closer to 10%. So it's, probably just about more than doubled over that period. So really tough, a lifetime of debt and potentially not a lot of capital gains to go alongside it.
Absolutely, and I mean that's the point, right, of the latest analysis. Your report, Housing Update 2022, looking at just how challenging it is when it comes to looking at those various metrics. Yes, back in '87, when you had really high interest rates, you were paying nearly half of your income to service your first year mortgage, roughly equivalent to what you're paying now if you're getting your mortgage for the first time in 2022. But that lifetime costs, throughout the 2000s and the 2010s, you're paying 20-odd%, on average across the lifetime. You're now paying over 30%. So I mean that's a whole lot of money that goes into one area of your life and not into another. I guess that wider question is, what does that mean in terms of how house prices have still been going up over time? Is it, because I'm buying a more expensive house, but it's obviously, expected in a sense, or has been expected to go higher? Is that still a reality for people in terms of house prices continuing to make the money so that, yes, they pay a lot over time, but they still come out with some pretty good gains, or is that period over?
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk to people and they go, "Oh, you're being overly pessimistic in terms of your house price projections to reach this result." And I'm like, well, I could come out with a more positive result for you, today's first home buyer. But if I do that, those house price to income ratios get even further stretched. I think one of the scenarios we've got in our report, by 2047, your house price to income ratio, rather than the 9 or 9.5 as you've got now, would be sitting up at 26, which is 26. Just completely outlandish. I mean, if that number came true, there'll be nobody who can afford to buy a house in New Zealand by that point in time. So yes, we're used to house prices going up over time, and the old mantra is, safe as houses, house prices never fall. But we're seeing that now. We've seen it in the GFC where house prices did decline, and I'd argue the market is actually a lot more stretched now than it was in the GFC. You add in, rising interest rates, a slowing economy. At the moment, a net migration outflow, you've got high oil prices as well, It all starts to, a lot of residential building activity, all of that together starts to feel a little bit like the 1970s. And you go back to 1974 through to 1980, house prices didn't fall in nominal terms because consumer price inflation was running at almost 15% per annum. But in real terms, they declined almost 40% over a 6-year period. And so that's the sort of correction that we could be in for over the next few years because those ratios have got so stretched. So yeah, if you want to, be optimistic about housing, by all means do it. But it's really hard to see it in the numbers at the moment.
And realistically, given how much that we quite rightly complain about the difficulties of affordability, at that 9 to 10 ratio, it would take what 66% house price falls or 120% income boosts to get you back to that sort of Goldilocks zone of 3. Gosh, 26. I mean, there's just no point in even contemplating it. That's insane. Why is all of this important? Because I think we get transfixed right with the numbers quite a lot of the time, but there are some real, societal issues with people being unable to buy their own homes and similar. The home ownership rate at its lowest now in 60, maybe 70 years, I think, on the latest numbers. I mean, where are we going from here, and why is it important that we actually turn it around? Because as a young person who doesn't own a home, it certainly feels important. Is that just me sort of, setting my expectations too high that I should be able to get, a lame first house?
There's two key issues, I think, in terms of why it's important. One is that in terms of the way New Zealand's tax and welfare system is set up, there's a whole lot of financial benefits that you get from owning your own home. It's, tax-free capital gains if it does go up in value. There's a whole lot of non-financial benefits as well in terms of security and of tenure and being able to do things to your house and make it a nicer place to live that you just can't do when renting. You think about getting to retirement age. I know that's a long way off for you, Brad, but when you get there, at the moment, NZ Super for a couple is $700 a year. Sorry, $700 a week, $700 a year. That wouldn't be very much, would it? But even at $700 a week, if you're having to rent your accommodation at that point in time, you're not going to have much money left over to buy food or electricity or anything like that. So it's premised on the fact that you, by retirement age, you do own your own home and you don't face those higher accommodation costs that younger people do. So that's one important aspect. The second important aspect is around, equity within New Zealand. And we like to think of ourselves as an egalitarian society, but realistically, with house prices where they are at the moment, and indeed with the 20% deposit requirement with the LVR restrictions in place, for most young people, the only way they can ever feel like they might get into the housing market is with a bit of help from mum and dad in terms of, a loan or a gift. And the only reason their parents can probably help them is because they own their own home in the first place and can draw down on that equity. You can immediately see then if that's the only way young people can get into the housing market, you've got a big divide between the people who have that opportunity, they come from a house owning family, and the people who don't. And that wedge is only going to get wider over time if we don't do something about the housing affordability issues that we've got facing now and that have got worse and worse over the last 20 years.
Look, I mean, a fairly grim assessment of where the housing market is at the moment, and certainly, food for thought when people are thinking about getting into the market, and also where we might be heading as a country, but also a key focus here on, unless we get serious about the housing sector, unless we start to put into place those and continue those focuses on actually opening up, developable land, thinking about infrastructure provision and similar, we've got some real tough challenges on our hands, and says to politicians and decision makers that either they get serious or something like a 26 house price to income ratio might actually scarily be a reality for New Zealand at some point one day. With that, we'll continue to assess not only where the housing market is going in the near term, but what those wider societal influences might be when it comes to housing outcomes and where the government's willing to go on one of our future editions of Econ Talks.